Certainly, thank you so much for inviting me, and good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many people in the room today. I just want to start by setting out our solidarity with the brave people of Ukraine who are faced with Putin's illegal and brutal invasion. And I don't think any of us can fail to be moved by the images that are emerging literally every day from that war. And of course, our thoughts and prayers and our support with the people of Ukraine. And yet, though the world faces this immense and immediate danger, we all know that the chronic threat of climate change remains. And that's obviously the key issue that I want to talk about this morning. But it's also great to be back in my old stomping ground, the Square Mile. This is where actually I started my investment banking career as a fresh-faced youth in the early 1990s. And back then, I mean, I think looking at this audience, you're all sort of far younger than I am, but I think there are one or two people who might recall the early 1990s. But you will know that back then, climate hadn't really registered in the city. You recall there was a guy called Swampy. Anybody recall Swampy? Yeah, some of you recall Swampy. Okay. And he spent much of his time occupying trees and tunnels, and he was in fact the main face of climate action in the UK. But what I would say, and I've said this before, is that actually I believe that increasingly the Swampies of the world, they're not protesting in trees and tunnels, although I think Swampy is still active. But they're literally all around us. They're in boardrooms, they're on trading floors across the globe. You represent the new Swampies. Because reality is that I think business and finance has actually awakened to the green agenda. And you will know that green finance is very much booming. We had over 5,200 businesses worldwide, many of them actually very large multinationals, who've signed up to stringent net zero targets through the United Nations Race to Zero campaign. We've got actually 60% of the FTSE that have signed up to net zero. You'll also know that at COP26, we had the announcement that financial institutions representing over $130 trillion of assets have signed up to the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. I mean, that's 40% of all financial assets under management around the world. And I think I want to pay tribute particularly to Mark Carney and his team for the work that he did with us on that. And I think that figure will continue to grow. In my view, there are three reasons for this particular shift. I think first is actually many businesses realize this is the right thing to do. Secondly, they're hearing this from their clients and customers. This is what clients and customers want. And I think particularly looking around this room, there are so many younger people, if I can call it like that, without, I don't want to sort of patronize anyone, but certainly I think there are people of a younger generation here than certainly me. And I think this is increasingly a demand. But thirdly, it's also good for the bottom line. Businesses who are going green, investing in green technologies know that ultimately this is going to benefit their shareholders as well. And so I think this is one of the key reasons why net zero is emerging as one of the clearest economic trends in recent years. I mean, let's look at renewables, for instance. They're now cheaper than coal and gas in the majority of the world. Coal investments are increasingly at risk of becoming stranded assets. And 90% of the global economy is now covered by net zero targets. When we took on the organization of COP26, it was less than 30%. And we built that trust, we built that over a period of 2 years. So we've got over 90% of the global economy now covered by a net zero target. And actually, I think finance and business are very much at the forefront, pushing the world to net zero, as indeed are citizens and civil society. And the private sector, in my view, is absolutely crucial to driving change across the real economy, investing in solutions and financing the transition. And they're absolutely stepping up to the plate. And you see this every day around the world. Last month, I was in Vietnam and I witnessed the signing of a $2 billion letter of intent between HSBC and one of the biggest wind farm developers in Vietnam called Trung Nam. I also heard about Lego. Lego are investing $1 billion in a new factory in Vietnam. But they have a condition for this investment, which is that this factory has to be carbon neutral. And as a result of that, a solar plant is being built nearby on Lego's behalf to power its operations. Now, I think such actions from the private sector are absolutely vital, and they are urgent, because the reality is that climate change is unfortunately accelerating. You will have seen the report that came out last August from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which said that we're already at average global warming of 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And you see the effects of this around the world. I had the privilege last year to go to almost 40 countries over an 8-9 month period, and I met very many people on the front line of climate change. And there are millions and millions of lives and livelihoods that are being affected now as a result of the changing climate. We also saw the IPCC's latest report, which came out a few weeks ago, and that was agreed by almost 200 countries. It synthesized 34,000 papers, and it was clear on the effect that climate change is having around the world. And that particular report from the IPCC concluded that ecosystems have been irreversibly damaged, that literally half of humanity is already highly vulnerable to climate change, and that the impacts of climate change are coming faster and more ferociously than we had previously thought. And the fact is that unless we act now, quickly, to stem the tide, I'm afraid we're heading towards climate catastrophe. And governments, I think, are increasingly aware of this threat because they're facing the effects of it today. I spoke yesterday at an event in the city on resilience, and the insurance industry was there in force. They know the impact of a changing climate in terms of increasing costs on businesses. Last month, I also visited Indonesia. I went to Jakarta. I went to see the seawall. How many of you have been to Jakarta? I'm sure some people have been to Jakarta. Yes, we've got people to Jakarta. So I would just say to you, next time you go to Jakarta, please go and have a look at the seawall. And this is a wall that is protecting the city from the rising sea levels, and they're experiencing up to 20 centimeters of sea level rise a year. And if you look at this wall, you will see where every few years they've added a little bit more, a little bit more. And this is the impact of a changing climate and a city, a major city, having to adapt. Of course, last year we saw catastrophic floods in Europe, in Asia, and you saw wildfires blazing across North Africa and Australia. And I think such events did actually help to focus the minds of leaders and ministers at COP26. And leaders did come to Glasgow with a real understanding that cooperation on climate was in our collective self-interest. And they did cooperate. We had almost 200 countries come together, agree what I believe is a historic Glasgow Climate Pact agreement. And this does keep alive the ambition of limiting the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees centigrade. We have a whole bunch of commitments that countries made as part of this pact. One of the key ones is that they have agreed to revisit and strengthen their 2030 emissions reduction targets this year as necessary to align with the Paris temperature goals. And the agreement also calls on countries to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies and to phase down coal power. In short, the very clear message coming from Glasgow confirms that the future of the global economy is indeed green. Now, I do think the commitments that were made at Glasgow were historic, and that's what I hear from governments and ministers around the world. But, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. At this stage, they are literally words on a page. And what has to happen during this year and next year and the year after that is to ensure that all of these commitments are actually turned into action. And we have what Zane's talked about is a year of delivery. So that is going to be our absolute priority during the rest of this year, our presidency year, which ends in November when we hand over to Egypt. And that is about delivery, making sure that these commitments actually come through. But it's worth pointing out that none of this is going to be possible without finance. And the reality is that countries need cash to turn commitments into action. Now, public finance is absolutely vital, and we heard about the 100 billion, but that alone, frankly, is never going to be enough. What we need is to get private finance flowing to clean, resilient investments around the world. And so we need more and more financial firms to commit to stringent net zero targets through the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And we need those that have already done so to deliver on those commitments and to deliver with integrity. We also need to make sure that money is deployed to funding the move to clean technologies, particularly in emerging markets. Frankly, today, not enough private capital is going to these markets. And to reach net zero by 2050, annual clean energy investment in emerging and developing economies needs to increase more than 7 times. So currently it's less than $150 billion a year. That's what it was last year. We need to get to $1 trillion by 2030. Now, look, I completely understand that there are risks with investments. And frankly, that's why we need public and private finance to work together to reduce those risks and to encourage private investment. There are innovative public-private partnerships that are being launched to support these efforts. For example, the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative has a new country pilot in India. And this works with the City of London and major financial institutions to identify opportunities in clean energy. The South Africa Just Energy Transition Partnership, which we announced at COP26, is going to mobilize an initial $8.5 billion to support South Africa's energy transition from coal. And last week, I co-chaired a meeting of G7 ministers together with multilateral development banks and indeed the private sector as well, to discuss how we replicate the South Africa model in other developing nations. So I urge financial institutions with us today to work with development finance institutions to hone their mobilization strategies and to leverage more private capital. And of course, to ensure that your funds are financing the building of wind turbines, charging points, and climate resilient infrastructure around the world. And to all of you here with us, all the businesses represented, I also request you to take action across your supply chains. Urge your suppliers to make net zero commitments and support them to reach their targets. Use your purchasing power to create a change that ripples out across the global economy. And to those businesses and financial institutions that have not joined the United Nations Race to Zero campaign, or indeed GFANZ, please consider doing so. And for those that have, as I said, please set out credible short-term targets and deliver on them with integrity. As you know, there are concerns amongst civil society and others about greenwashing. So it's absolutely imperative that the promises that are being made by private sector are honoured, that governments and civil society actually see the private sector delivering. Now, the United Nations Secretary General, I know, spoke at this event yesterday, and he will, of course, very soon be announcing members of an expert group to advise him on assessing the integrity of private sector commitments. Here in the United Kingdom, you will know that it'll become mandatory for UK financial institutions and listed companies to publish net zero transition plans from 2023. So in conclusion, colleagues, friends, those of you here today have the power to shift the global economy. The opportunities really are enormous in terms of investment, in terms of jobs, in terms of GDP growth. And your influence collectively is really immense. And you all know that the need is urgent. So please make net zero commitments, back them up with concrete plans, honor them, and get money to projects on the ground. And together, let's make 2022 a year of delivery. Thank you.